we're going to continue now in our series through 1 Timothy. We are now in 1 Timothy chapter 5. We'll be going through verses 3 through 16. And I really think we maybe will finish this before Thanksgiving. We're maybe getting there, but that's okay. We're not in a hurry. We're wanting to make sure that we spend some time with the text, allowing God's Spirit to work through it in our lives. And today we're talking about something that was a really big deal in the cultural context that Timothy was ministering in: widows. Now, the least of these, those that were in a very precarious social situation, the strangers, aliens, orphans, widows, all those kinds of people were near and dear to God's heart. And He actually made sure in His law that you can read about in the Old Testament that there were ways that these people were provided for. People that were relocated, aliens, kids that had lost their parents, orphans, and widows who'd lost their husbands. They were in a very bad social position in this period of history, and as a result, God made sure that they were cared for. It was against God's law to take advantage or mistreat any of these people. You had to, out of your tithe, make sure that they were fed. You had to make sure that your fields, you couldn't, after you harvested, you couldn't go back and pick up what you left. You had to leave it in the field for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. God cared very much about them. And this situation was something that needed to be addressed in the church in Ephesus that Timothy was left to minister in. Now, we're talking about a very specific context here. Widows in the first century in a city called Ephesus. There's a lot of things we're going to deal with that are incredibly specific to that time and in that area. However, there are principles that the Lord gives to Timothy that we can pick right up and transport them to the 21st century and drop them in our laps right now, Horse Pasture, Virginia, in the 21st century. But we will have to do a little bit of navigating between things that were very specific to them and things that we're going to have to do a little bit of work to apply it to our experience now, all right? To get us started off, I do want to tell y'all a story a little bit. This is a story that takes place in Ireland back during the potato famine. And during that period of history, a lot of Irish people left Ireland, moved to the United States so that they could eat. However, there was a large number of the population that they didn't have means to move. They were stuck. They had little to no food, and they were in incredibly deep poverty. This story takes place during that time when there was an older man living with his son and his son's wife and child. And food was scarce, and the son had noticed that his dad was doing nothing but sitting in the corner. He wasn't able to get up and work. He couldn't really contribute in any way. All he was doing is eating, and since food was limited, that was stressing the son out. He figured something had to be done about this. So he said, all right, the old man's out. He's out. We're getting him out of the house because he is not doing anything to bring food and resources in. All he is doing is eating what we got. Well, the wife didn't like that. She said, you can't do that. That's horrible. You can't just throw him out into the world. You got to take care of him. He said, nope, I got to take care of you all. He's gone. And so after much fighting, she said, okay, fine. If you're going to send him out, at least give him a way to keep warm. Give him a blanket to wrap around himself. And he said, no, we got but one blanket in this whole house. He gets half of a blanket. That's it. We'll cut it down the middle. We'll keep half for the baby, and he gets the other half, then he's gone. And she said, oh, you can't do that. And the man and the woman were fighting, and he was about to just grab the blanket and send the man out. And then the baby that was in the cradle stood up, and just a voice as plain as you or I as an adult said, I'll only give him half the blanket because I'll need the other half, Dad, when I send you out. When you get old. We all get old if you live long enough, right? If you live long enough, you get old. And we live in a society that tends to not want to deal with that fact. This was an issue back in Paul's day and age. People were getting older, and a married couple that grow up into old age together, one of them is left without the other. Widows would be very prevalent because it's still the case now. Typically, in a lot of situations, men die before women do. And in that culture, that happened a lot more commonly because women were younger when they got married and the men were older, so there was that end of it, plus just the nature of the work. But it was vastly more common to be a widow than a widower. And so there was a large population of widows in the Ephesian church. And Paul, rooting himself in the Old Testament law, showing God's heart, we got to take care of the next generation, especially widows, writes instructions to Timothy because apparently there was a situation going on there that was causing problems. First thing, the widows need to be dealt with. So 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3 says to honor widows who are truly widows. We're going to stop right there because already there's a distinction made between widows at large and then a group that is called true widows or actual widows. Well, what's the difference? Isn't anybody that loses a spouse, any woman who loses her husband, isn't she a widow? Well, yeah, on one hand, but in a deeper sense, it is possible to be an actual widow, what Paul calls a true widow. Well, here's what he means. You go on to the next verse, in verse 4. He says, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relative, especially the members of his own household, he has denied the faith and has become worse than an unbeliever. Wow, you know, so much for just sending Granny off to the nursing home and never visiting her, right? You can't do that. Christians do not have that, I'm using quotes, luxury to just forget about parents and grandparents. In fact, one of the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother. Do you know that doesn't quit when you move out of the house? You are called to honor them your entire life, their entire life. And so the first line of defense in helping widows in the Ephesian congregation was not to just immediately tap into the church treasury or to immediately get them on the support list, which we'll talk about that in a second. It was to ask, do they have children or grandchildren? Because if they do, the best way to help them is to tell their children and grandchildren to fulfill their obligation as a Christian child or grandchild. And then he says, if you're not doing that, you are acting worse than an unbeliever. That is going even against natural affection for your parents. Christians know better. And so if you have a parent or a grandparent, it is your bound responsibility as a Christian and just as a human being to take care, in this context of your mother, in our context, it could be anybody, either of our parents or grandparents in a position in need. We as Christians are called to be there to help them. Now, this is not to say that there are not circumstances where it becomes necessary for someone to be put into an assisted living or nursing care facility. Nowadays, where people are living longer and they're living with chronic issues, it's very common for them to need ongoing medical supervision and medication that cannot be safely administered at home. So this isn't a never ever do that, it's bad. No, not a broad stroke statement. Each situation has to be carefully navigated through. But the principle behind it all is they are entrusted to your care, and you are to make sure their needs are met. And you are there honoring God by honoring them. And so, if there are people in need, step one, it's do they have family? Because why isn't their family taking care of them? So that's the first thing to deal with. So that's avenue one. If there's people in need, if there's widows, Timothy, if they have children and grandchildren, let them take care of the widow so that those that are truly widows can be cared for. What a person that Paul is calling is a true widow, what that means is they literally have nobody. Their husband's gone, maybe they never had children and therefore no grandchildren. Maybe their family, they were unbelievers. And when she became a Christian, she doesn't have that networking. And so what comes into play is something that we talked about a couple weeks ago. The church is a family. If you lose family or you have no family or your family leaves you because of your faith in Christ, who is your family? The church. Remember the family language from chapter 5, verses 1 and 2? Paul hits that hard. We are family in Christ. And if there is a widow that does not have family to care for her, we step in and say, you are our mother in Christ. We are your spiritual children and grandchildren, and we will make sure that you are taken care of. In this context, Timothy is dealing with specifically widows in Ephesus. For us, if there's an elderly person, period, in our congregation that does not have family active or around or living, or they're not living up to being what a Christian child should be, we're their family. We're here to take care of them. I want you to know about a couple opportunities that we have available as a congregation that is taking this seriously. Lily Mae, I know I saw her. There, she's in the back. So if you have any questions about this, go see Lily Mae Merriman. She can help you out. But a place, an area of life that people struggle with a lot, or when they're losing loved ones, or when they're going through, even if it's not end of life, but they're going through a severe disease, people struggle really bad. And hospice is something that is in place to help people walk through all that. We have an opportunity as a congregation to be involved in that area of people's life. We are providing, Lily Mae's heading it up, but hospice training. To be able to go and to be trained, to be able to sit in with people that are either, now hospice doesn't always mean end of life. That's how I understood it. I was wrong. It doesn't always mean that. A lot of times it means end of life care, but also it's just when people are going through battling a very grave and serious illness. Either way, these are people in time of need, and us being able to be there through this time of need, a large percentage of these people are elderly, and our presence with them is something that can go a long way in showing them the heart of Jesus Christ. And if God puts that on your heart, this is a tangible way our church is trying to do this very thing, honoring that generation before us. You can see Lily Mae, and she'll get you pointed in the right direction. Also, just encourage you, go visit a nursing home. Right now, check, because a lot of them have COVID. Check before you go. But if everything's cleared, there are a lot of people in nursing homes whose family visit them and advocate for them and go and pray for them and bring them gifts. That's amazing. But I can tell you, having gone in them regularly, there's a whole lot more people who don't have that. A lot of people just left off to their own in a room by themselves, essentially, for months. And we, as the children of God, can go in and be a presence in their life that they need desperately and can share Jesus with them. And another thing, going back to the hospice thing, making prayer layettes for them is something that's being done. If you have that gift, I certainly don't, but if you do, talk to Lily Mae. She can talk to you about that. Is it crocheting? Is that the proper thing? Okay, crocheting a prayer shawl that are delivered to people that are under hospice care, or I think the nursing home also. But see Lily Mae, she can get you filled in about some of those things. Bottom line is, specific context for Timothy, widows in the church. Pick that up and drop it now. Widows, absolutely. But also more. Those that are in a position of life, that generation before us that are left alone, that don't have anybody advocating for them, that are struggling day by day, sometimes to find food or to get things around the house done. We, if they are our brothers and sisters, we're called to be their family for them. It's something that we ought to take seriously. We move on through this, though, and we find something really interesting. Widows, true widows, those that have no family, that are left truly alone, but then Paul begins to unpack more qualifications. If a widow is going to be put on ongoing support by the church, because this is apparently what was happening, they were constantly kept up, fed, clothed, housed by the church, there were even more qualifications involved in this. And that's what we're going to look at now. So Paul tells Timothy, all right, so if they're truly a widow, you got to take care of them. If they have family, tell their family to get on the ball and take care of your mother or grandmother. If they don't have any family, we're their family. We're the church. But here's the thing. Verse 9, let a widow be enrolled. Now we're going to stop before we go any further because that word enrolled shows us a couple things. One, it shows us that this was an organized ministry. This wasn't just a running around trying to find the next thing to get plugged into or the next person to try to throw resources at. This had a lot of organization involved to it. This was something that had an official list for people to be put on to ensure that their needs were met. And that's relevant for us because if a church feels strongly about a ministry, it needs to organize and be equipped to be able to serve that ministry, right? You don't succeed for what you don't plan for. You got to be intentional about helping people and have a plan on how to accomplish what God's put there. God calls us to be focused. And this is a reflection of that. Here in Ephesus, they had an actual legitimate official list that widows could be put on to ensure that they got help. But here's another interesting thing about this word enlist. Usually, it is used in reference to military enlistments. It is a word that means you're put on the official military list and you are inscribed in some official capacity for service. So we know a couple things about this list. The thing we absolutely know is that those that were on this list received help. A thing that we can't necessarily 100% know from the Scriptures themselves is the second thing. Now, like I said, we can't prove it 100% from the Bible itself, but we can take this concept of being enrolled with something we're going to see in a couple verses, a warning that Paul gives. We can take these two things together, mainly about the younger widows giving up their first commitment. We'll talk about that in a second. So we can take those two things together, plus we can look to the 2nd century. Beyond the Bible, in the 2nd century, we see documentation of an order of widows that were put on a list for ministry service. And it feels very likely that even if it wasn't full-blown in the 1st century during Paul's time, it was the seeds planted that became this by the 2nd century, that there was a group of widows who committed to do ongoing ministry in the church and for the church. And as a result, the church made sure their needs were met. So it was to receive help. That was the absolutely 100% thing we know. And the extremely likely thing that I would contend is the most reasonable thing to take from this is that they received help, but they also were plugged into ongoing ministry in the church. So a widow is not to be enrolled. They're not to receive help, and they're not to be plugged into this official ongoing capacity of service if they are under 60 years of age. All right. Back in the 1st century, 60 was old. Now it's the new 40. It's okay, all right? Back in the day, 60 was like you're knocking on death's door. Some of y'all are just getting revved up when you're 60. Remember, culturally, it was different. People didn't live near as long back then. Health was not what it is now. They didn't have the things in place to keep people alive like they do now. So if you were 60, then you were old. Just saying. So 60 was the cutoff for them. Moving on. Having been the wife of one husband. Literally, remember the elder qualification, a one-woman man? This is the inverse, a one-man woman. That's interesting. And having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. There's not just these widows, they just show up at church and sit around. They were engaged in the congregational life of the family of God. They were active members of God's family. So Paul says, look, to put them on the list, they have to actually be engaged in loving God's people. And then he lists qualifications for receiving help from the church. Something we learn here, the church is supposed to help people. We're supposed to use of our resources to feed and to clothe and to assist and to be there for people. Non-Christian people, absolutely. We should. However, we are obligated, it is our responsibility to take care of the household of God. Widows that are part of the family of God. It is our absolutely uncompromising responsibility to make sure they are taken care of. And then if we have needs to be met and our resources can meet them, once we've met the needs of our family, we branch out. But we have to feel this burden and understand this. The church is never called just to throw resources out blindly. We have limited resources, and they were told to be wise with them. We likewise are called to be wise with them. And so a widow, to be put on the widow's list, had to show she loved God's people and was engaged in taking care of the church. Remember, I said the most reasonable way to understand this list is to understand it as some kind of ministry capacity that they will be fulfilling. Well, here's another reason why that seems to be the case. The word enroll seems to hint towards that, but also these qualifications listed look very similar to the list of qualifications for elders and for deacons, which are qualifications for ministry, right? In fact, there's a direct overlap. The elder is to be the husband of one wife or a one-woman man. Inversely, the widow on the widow's list is to be a one-man woman, and then goes on and talks about various areas of service showing she is living out her faith. So what we got going on here, and this is going to be, hang with me. I know this is a hard thing to tread through, all right? Talking about widows in Ephesus in the first century, but it's relevant for us because what it shows us is that God's people, no matter what stage of life that they're in, are called to serve. These widows had something to do. They weren't considered too old or too wore out or, they've got hard life, they don't need. God says, listen, I can work in you and through you regardless of your circumstance. Show the fruit of godliness in your life. Show that you love God's people, and I will be there working in and through you. And Paul says that's absolutely right. Put them on the widow's list if they're engaged in doing ministry, and make sure that they are kept up. Because in this context, the women, they couldn't just get up and go out and get a job like they can nowadays. It was different. If they weren't being clothed and fed by some patron, a husband or a child or the church, they were in dire straits. And so he says, make sure they're taken care of, but this isn't meant to be a luxury retirement vacation. They're supposed to be engaged in ministry in the church. And that helps us understand what he says next about the younger widows. The younger widows. Verse 11, refuse to enroll them. Don't put them on this list of support. Don't put them on this list of enrolling them to be on ongoing service for the life of the church. Why? Well, because they're young. They still have these desires to get married at some point and have children. So do not enroll them, because when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to get married. Is it wrong to get married? Absolutely not. He encourages them to do so. What the problem is they were wanting to be enrolled in this list for ongoing ministry and service to be kept up by the church, but then after beginning this ongoing ministry in the church, they had a change of heart because they're young and want to get married. So instead of being married literally to the church, they want to get married to a husband, and then they give up their first commitment to be serving the church. So he says, look, younger women then, don't even bother putting them on the list. Instead, encourage them to go ahead and get married. Because when their passions cause them to want to get married, they're drawn away from Christ. Verse 12, they incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. That's not their Christianity they've abandoned. It's their commitment to serve in a ministerial way. And then he says, besides this, now this, okay. Besides, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what ought not to be done. Now, I'm glad that the church in 2,000 years has grown and matured past a need for this ever to be addressed in a sermon. Nobody is idle to the point of being a gossip and busybody anymore, right? We moved, yeah, right. This has been amplified. This is not suggesting that women are more prone to this than men. That's not the point. Remember, we got to contextualize this. In this period of history, the men were busy working, and the women were busy managing the home. They didn't have as much time as we do to be idle and get into trouble unless all their responsibilities were gone. Like your husband died and you got no kids and you can't get a job, so then the church is fitting the bill for stuff you do, and you can be like, I got all kinds of free time. And then you're idle. You heard the phrase that idleness is the devil's workshop? It's this principle of play. You see, today, thanks to technology, we got a whole lot of time to be idle, don't we? Jobs that used to take hours now literally take minutes. We got more free time than we know what to do with. We don't even have to go from house to house to be idle, gossip, busybodies. We can do this. And we can know who's going where on vacation, what they ate for lunch on their way to vacation, who bought what shoes, what they think of those shoes, whose kid made track. Who cares? But we seem to as a culture. We have idleness built into our culture so often. That's what the danger was for them. And Paul says, look, just get married so that you have a house to raise in a Christian home. Fulfill duty as a Christian at this time, a Christian mother and a Christian wife, so that you're not idle getting into trouble all the time. There's work to be done. We're not called to sit around and be idle and fill our idle space with that's the word busybody literally in the original means sticking your nose in other people's business. If it's not your business, don't make it your business. If you got enough business to make other people's your business, you need to be more focused on God's business. And that's the point that Paul is making in this statement to these younger widows. Look, just settle down, build a home, build a family, pointing people to Jesus. Quit being idle and walking around and gossiping, talk about what ought not to be talked about, sticking your nose in other people's business. That is relevant today, just like it was relevant then. We got to ask ourselves, how are we spending our time? Because if it's not your business, it ain't your business. Our focus should be on growing the kingdom of God. These women were called to go about doing that by marrying and having children. There's something to be said for that. I don't have time. I'm not going to tell, I was going to tell kind of a story, but I'm not because I see what time it is. There's something to be said. I will say this much of it. Did you know that there's a lot of people concerned about a population crisis coming upon us because people aren't having kids? It was, it's going to be overpopulated and we're all going to die. Go back and read it now. There's legitimate concern that that superpowers are losing so many people per generation that they're not going to have enough people to run their country. And it's funny because God told us to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and all that stuff. What if Christians outbirth everybody? Imagine how much easier it would be for us to fulfill the Great Commission. There's an easy way to grow churches, right? And to have more Christians engaged in ministry. Paul might be onto something here. He says, get married, have kids. Does this mean that you're not a real Christian if you don't have kids? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's not the point. The point, though, is to give legitimacy to having kids. It's a good thing. It's not a problem. I know a lot of Christians, we don't want to have kids because this world's so bad, so terrible. I don't want to bring them up in this kind of world. I don't want to do that. Boniface, a preacher in Kenya, I told him a little bit. He said, how come in America the average number of children per household is 1.3 or something? I was like, I don't know how you do the point thing, but it's an average. It's an average. And I said, well, I mean, it costs a lot to feed them. He's like, it costs us a lot to feed them, you know? And I was like, yeah, and I know a lot of Christians get concerned about that. He's like, yeah. He's like, but in Kenya, we have kids so that they can change our country. Like the next generation, we have them with the optimism that they are going to make a difference. And I think that built-in optimism is something that is in line with the Christian faith. Encouraging thing to think about. Anyways, I was going to go a little bit more into that, but I'm not. There is a legitimacy between marriage and family, having children. Now, if that's not in the cards for you, that doesn't mean that you're any less of a Christian. Absolutely not. You can fulfill God's mission and bearing His image completely satisfactorily as a single person or as a married couple without kids, no problem. But for those that do have children, that is an opportunity, not a burden. He goes on, we're going to wrap out this chapter. No, we're not. Sorry. We're going to wrap out this section. You're like, wrap out this chapter. No. So it encourages younger women to marry, bear children, manage their households, to give the adversary no occasion for slander, because some have already strayed after Satan. They have allowed their lives to become the devil's workshop because they have become idle. They have allowed him to enter in and use their time for his purposes rather than God's. Verse 16, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Again, he's right back to that. Listen, if you got family to take care of, step up and take care of them. He mentions the women here because, again, in this culture, typically the women would stay home and manage the house. So if a widow needed help during the day, it was the woman at home that would be available to go and help the widow. So this doesn't mean that only women are supposed to take care of widows. For them, contextually, that's what made sense. But amplify that, all of us are called to be engaged in helping the generation before us. We're going to close out, and I want you to wrestle with three things. What is it that God's Word is challenging you with today? If you're already a Christian, here's three things to think about based on what we just talked about. We talked a lot about their context, but we want to pick it up and lay it in front of us and say, okay, so what does this mean for us? First thing it means is that we are obligated as God's people to take care of the generation before us. Widows specifically, especially, but any of the least of these, the elderly that our society so often wants to try to ignore, pretend like they don't exist, send them off to an institution so we don't got to deal with them, that's not acceptable from the Christian point of view. We are called to compassionately and lovingly care for them and be there for them. We are not in a position where we can just act like aged people don't exist. They are our mothers and our fathers and our grandfathers and our grandmothers in Christ. And we are bound by Christ to take care of them. That's the first thing. The second thing, we're never in a position where God says, you're retired from serving me. No matter where you are, what your context is, no matter how old you are or you aren't, whether you're a widow or you're not, whether you're young or you're old, it doesn't matter. God has something He will and can do in and through you. So what's He calling you to do? Where is it that He is pushing you to serve? These widows in Paul's day were called specifically to minister in very tangible, meaningful ways. Maybe some of you are being called to that very same thing. A last thing to think about that we got to wrestle with is there is a very real responsibility for us as God's people to take care of our families. We're called to make sure that we are meeting the needs of those closest to us. We talked about the older generation, but we also got to make sure that we are meeting needs in our own families, because the reality is our culture keeps moving in the direction it's going. Resources aren't as plentiful as they used to be, and the church has to be very careful with the use of them. So we are called to be wise in our own families so that the church can be free to help those in their deepest time of need. If you stand up, we're going to sing a song. And if you haven't already made a decision to follow Jesus, this is an opportunity for you to come and to do that. And we can talk about what it means to place your faith in Jesus this morning.